I am delighted to say that with me on the panel, I have Lord Fred Ponsonby, who is the co-chair of the Justice Union's parliamentary group, who is here in person with us today. We have Sarah Burrows, the Chief Executive Officer for Children Heard and Seen, who will be joining us by video. Thank you, everybody. We have Jack Cordery, who's the National Director of Operations for Cafcass. Thank you. And we have apologies from Angela Cousins, who's the Regional Probation Director for South Wales. Unfortunately, she's unwell, sends her apologies. Oh, sorry, Southwest. Thank you. Right, first we will hear from Sarah Burrows. Thank you very much. We're just waiting for Sarah to join us online. Thank you. Here we go. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you very much. My name is Sarah Burrows. I'm from a charity specifically that's supporting children who have a parent in prison in their communities. The charity is called Children Heard and Seen. I set it up in 2014 because I was concerned about the number of children who were entering the criminal justice system that had a parent in prison. I've got a series of short slides just to go through with you. So if they could come up, that would be great.
And now on the screen, thank you.
So looking in terms of impact of children having a parent in prison, it obviously often starts prior to the parent actually going into custody. The little shot that I'm going to show you was a 7-year-old boy who was staying with his father. His mother and father had separated. She had left the family home and but it was her family home, and he was staying with the father once every 2 weeks. And the child that you'll hear in this clip is a 7-year-old boy. Could you play the clip, please? It doesn't actually sound, I don't think the audio really came through very well, but obviously that's a little boy of 7, and 2 years later he was still sleeping in his mother's bed and quite terrified. He went off to school the next day. They lived in Warrington. We were based in Oxfordshire. At that time we weren't supporting around the country, but she got in touch because she couldn't find any other support services out there. Moving on to the next slide, please. Oh no, don't press the link yet, please. One of the difficulties that we have had as a charity was identifying children who had a parent in prison. There isn't a statutory mechanism to identify and then to trigger support. And initially setting up in 2014, it was a case of banging on doors, going around to schools, GP surgeries, to probation, to the police, to try and identify children to receive support. We have been in a situation that we have had a number of children who have been living on their own. There is no parent. And this year, early on in the year, in fact, within a month, we had 5 lots of children from 5 different families who were living on their own. One boy of 15 had been living on his own for months, and no one had realised that his mother was in prison. His mother hadn't obviously said when she'd gone into custody. He had no gas, no electricity, and was getting up and going off to school in the morning, as were the other children. They hadn't, from the other 4 families, hadn't said. I think that the more we are getting known, more that we are identifying these children who are living on their own, and children shouldn't be slipping through the net. We have started quite an innovative project with Thames Valley Violence Reduction Unit and Thames Valley Police, and this little clip explains it, and I'm hopeful that it means that children are no longer going to be slipping through the net. Would you mind pressing on the link, please?
When someone is sent to prison, their families often struggle with the trauma alone. Kaylee was left with two confused children when their father was jailed 6 years ago.
I felt guilty for his crimes. I felt isolated. I felt like the world hated me and blamed me for what he'd done.
It's thought around 312,000 children have a parent in prison. 65% of boys in this situation go on to commit crime. 25% are likely to develop mental health problems, play truant and underperform in school. Now Thames Valley Police is piloting a scheme to quickly identify these vulnerable youngsters. For the first time, they're able to use data from the prison service to contact families and refer them to a dedicated charity called Children Heard and Seen.
Children just slip through the net. They're just not identified. We know it's an adverse childhood experience in terms of the trauma and everything they witness, and yet the mechanisms isn't in place to capture, and this will just change things for children.
So we know that there are a number of really traumatic incidents that can happen to children that then affect their lifestyle choices, can affect offending behaviours, can affect physical health going forward, outcomes for children who are affected. And imprisonment is actually one of the key childhood experiences that actually lead to harm in later life. So it's really important that we intervene earlier to reduce the chances of young people coming to harm as they get older.
Charity offers one-to-one help, mentoring, support groups and activity days. It's hoped this can break the chain of offending and ensure children don't become victims of their parents' crime.
The last time I seen my dad, I was 18 months old in the prison visit room. Unfortunately, I ended up in prison myself. So I hope that with the help from Children Heard and Seen, that my children don't go on to offend and end up in prison themselves. We're not responsible for his actions, and I hope that the children will grow up and really realise that.
With the help of the charity, Kaylee's children are now doing well in school, and she is studying to become a social worker. At the moment, the scheme is being piloted in Oxford City Centre, but it's hoped in time it will be extended across Oxfordshire and then the whole of the Thames Valley, where it will help up to 200 families every year. Mary Stanley, ITV News, Oxford.
Thank you. Could we go to the next slide, please? Looking at the sort of the wider harms of parental imprisonment, the children we support have had some quite horrendous things. We've had a number of children that have moved, changed their names, have pieces through the letterbox, have had concrete blocks through the window, have been badly assaulted, suggested that if they might as well kill themselves if their parent had done what their parent had done. There's some little buttons underneath the Rumours at School, Release, Losing Friends and Fears that children have put together. It's children we support, but changed it in terms of safeguarding. But I wonder, just try them if you can, but it might not work.
Someone came up to me in school and said there's a rumour running around that your dad is in prison, and I cried and I wasn't ready for everyone to know.
Losing friends as well, you should click on that.
I didn't have any friends. I lost all my friends. I moved away and they didn't want to keep in contact with me after they found out. I felt lonely.
Fear.
Are the police gonna come and take me away like they took my daddy away?
And Release.
Sentence is so long. My childhood will be over. He won't be able to see me do the things that I wanted him to see me do. I think it's upsetting. It's such a long time until I can actually see him properly.
One of the areas how we support children is a numerous amount of group work We are in Oxfordshire and North Birmingham, and we will be providing face-to-face. We provide face-to-face group work, but we provide every night of the week virtual support groups. It is a bit of the children of realising that they're not the only one, and having a shared experience, the sense that they're part of something, because they have had such negative effects from the community. A significant amount don't actually tell anybody that they have a parent in prison, and currently we're supporting about 280 children. We had a look last week and only 30% actually visit the parent in prison. Could you go on to the next slide, please?
Someone came up to me in school and said there's a rumour running around that
I
your
didn't have
dad
any
is
friends.
in
I lost
prison.
all.
So we offer, as I just said, we offer group work support for children, different, and we also offer support for the person caring for the children. We don't have many children in care. Most of the children are living with the other parent, and about 10% are living with the grandparent. The groups tend to be very general for the children, as I said, each night of the week. But for the parents, much more specific. We run 2 general ones for parents a week, virtual ones that are general. And then we run a weekly group for parents looking after children whose fathers are serving custodial offences for custodial offence for sex offences. And that group is split into 2, the ones that are choosing to remain in the relationship and the ones who are not in a relationship. And we also run a monthly virtual group for adults looking after children whose parents killed the other parent and is serving a custodial sentence. And that's all about coming together and having shared experience with one another. We provide one-to-one support for the children. It starts with how to tell your child, or how the child is told about having a parent in prison. We do personalised crib sheets, and we write them out for the parent, plan it around, look developmentally where the child is, what the child's level of understanding is, talk it through with the person looking after, and then they tell the child. Some that's enough, most this isn't. We then provide the one-to-one tailored support that is generally our workers are qualified social workers or from early intervention service, and support the child to make sense of their emotions and feelings about having a parent in prison and what that feels like. We devised a workbook to work through from sort of arrest to release in terms of where the child is, and the child can come in and out anytime in terms of coming back in if they want to revisit it. We also provide volunteer mentoring that ranges between 6 months and 18 months, and that's a volunteer mentor in the community that's a face-to-face support that's there for the child and is there as a neutral person, but is a good listener and actually can help the child to sort of make sense of everything that's going on, but also help in terms of aspirations, doing activities and things, and just generally doing maybe something very different. Yes, sorry, could you move on to the next slide, please? I think even talking about impact of having a parent in prison, we've got loads of information on our website, but the people that know best are the people that experience it. This is a film. I only want to show you like a few seconds of it, but it is quite a long film. A child, Luke, made the film with his volunteer mentor. He made it over 18 months in their sessions. It was their idea to want to do it about what it is actually like to have a parent in prison. So I'll just show you the introduction, but if anyone wants the links, it's on our website, or I'm really happy to send it because I think children can really explain it much better than I can. Do you mind pressing the link, please?
Hey, my name is Luke. I'm 10 years old and my dad is currently serving a sentence in prison. There are a lot of kids who go through having a parent in prison every year, but this is something that is not often talked about. I wanted to try and change that. And this project will be my attempt to help other kids who are going through the same thing. Hopefully my story will give you a better look and understanding of the reality of having a parent in prison.
And then the next slide, please. We've got loads on our website, particularly our news is always what's going on in terms of parents are doing, children are doing, but also we have a section on our website called family blogs and hidden sentence. The family blogs are written by parents and carers currently caring for a child with a parent in prison, and the Hidden Voices series, there are adults who had a parent in prison as a child and the impact on them now, the impact on them then, but writing now from an adult perspective. But please do get in touch if I can show you any links or talk about support that we offer. That's it.
Many thanks. Many thanks, Sarah. We'll now go to Jack. Just bear with us, please. Hello, welcome, Jack.
Thank you, Nicola, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to join a conference. It really takes me back many years, and what a moving presentation from Sarah to it. That also takes me back. So colleagues, my name is Jack Cordery. I'm the Director of Operations at Cafcass, and my pronouns are he and him. The reason it takes me back is I was a trainee probation officer in 1982, and I qualified in 1984, at a time where probation officers actually held child protection cases. For any of you in the conference that have been in the profession as long as myself. And the reason Sarah's presentation takes me back is that I experienced, obviously as you do, firsthand, and the trauma experienced by children of prisoners when they're arrested, and then how that trauma is compounded by separation and loss. And again, as Sarah was saying, and as those children were saying, by the stigma that can come with being a child of a parent who's in prison as well. I worked in an area team and a juvenile offenders team, as it was called in those days. I've also, as a court welfare officer and guardian ad litem, and as a court welfare officer in the 80s, in the late 80s, came across examples of parents in prison seeking contact through the family courts then, and that's still very much an issue then, and I want to talk about that in a minute in relation to Arthur Lavinia Hughes and the application that his mother made to spend time with her little boy, and for her little boy to spend time with her as well. I managed community service teams, field teams, as well as a senior probation officer, and I also worked in a prison, a category B prison, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that too. So I'm going to start by talking to you about being a senior probation officer in a prison, with those experiences that I had of the impact of the trauma, the separation and loss, and the stigma that can come for children whose parents are in prison, and particularly the separation and loss. It was a category B prison, which means that some of the offences male prison committed by those prisoners were very serious indeed, and where there's a social view that why should they have rights to see their family? They've lost those rights, those parental rights. But more importantly for me, it was about the rights of the children to still maintain contact with their parent, a parent that they love, a bond that they've made, and where the parent, despite their offences, still clearly love their children as well. And I was privileged enough to work with a very well-known #1 governor who was very sympathetic when I said I was not happy with the process that children and families went through when visiting, and I wasn't happy with the family visiting centre either. And he, very kindly, empathetically gave a sum of money. This is in the early 90s, a sum of money to really make a very child-friendly visitor centre for children. So, really focused on what the experience would be like for the child, but also adjusted the process, the searching process that children were observing their parent or carer going through when visiting the prison as well. Very enlightened governor, had some opposition from some of the other governors, the #5, #4 governors, and certainly from some of the senior prison officers as well, but won them round, and they in the end very much bought into it. And so it was a positive experience, and recruited somebody who is a little like Sarah actually, who actually managed the family visiting centre as well. So the reason I've given that little story is certainly not to big myself up, but to show that learning from experience as a practitioner is so critical in terms of feedback from children, observing what happens to children, and then trying to do our best to mitigate the impact of the loss of that parent by maintaining that contact safely, of course, maintaining that contact, but in an environment that is right for the child as well. And I know that things have moved on from there, but I'm also very aware from working directly with parents and carers of children in prison and with children themselves, having moved across to social work, local authority social work in the late 90s, the impact that it can have. And we need to keep being very sensitive and learning to that, which takes me to my current role as the Director of Operations in Cafcass. Over 1,700 social work qualified staff in Cafcass, with a lot of parents, obviously, of children in serving prison sentences. And I undertook the Cafcass learning review into the murder of Arthur Labignio Hughes, which was in a private law children's case, where father had stopped contact between Arthur and his mother, who was serving a prison at that sentence at that time for the murder of her new partner, later reduced to manslaughter, and the sentence was reduced as well. He had stopped contact once she was sentenced. Also, Arthur had been told in an inappropriate way, in my view, from the learning, about what had happened and why his mother was in prison. No child friendly, if that's the right term, or child orientated way of explaining what had happened and what prison was like and whatever. So father stopped contact. Mother made a application to spend time with for contact in old money. And that's where Cafcass becomes involved. And in the learning review, when we talked to the family court advisor who was allocated this child's case, she was very open with us. She's an absolutely amazing family court advisor, I have to say. We found nothing wrong with her practice at all. She absolutely met our standards, and she met the requirements of the court order as well in its entirety. But she was very open about her views at the outset, and she said that I really questioned why Arthur's mother would put him through this. He was freaked out about what he'd been told about what his mum had done. He was freaked out, you know, had a complete fantasy world about what prison was like, and was having nightmares about that as well. And her initial position was, why would Arthur's mother put him through this? Well, she very much changed her view. She changed her view very much as Sarah was saying, actually, because she spent time with Arthur, found out very clearly how important his bond with his mother was, despite this year of separation while the case had come to trial. That was not given up. You know, the little direct work that we do with very young children around, he wants to spend time, he loved spending time with his mum in the park, and what he wanted was for that to happen again. It also was very clear that his emotional well-being was being very badly affected by not having contact with his mother, by that having been stopped, and wondering what was happening, and that sense that he was never going to be able to speak to his mum on the phone again. We're talking about through the pandemic, COVID, where it was not possible to have direct contact. So he's having telephone contact that was arranged by his maternal grandparents. And so the family court advisor, in a very child-focused way, found out how important his mum was to him, found out the impact of the separation and the loss, and the fantasizing about what was happening. So she made really good contact with the family liaison officer at the prison that mum was in, reassured herself of the child-friendly arrangements that could be put in place for Arthur if he were to visit, and also spent a good deal of time talking to mum and to the prison psychologist about how mum would be able to manage her own feelings in seeing Arthur too. So all the things which really sound family court advice, social work is about, you know, doing it in the round, mixture of rights, but making sure that the welfare of the child is paramount in the court's recommendation. And against the father's wishes, she made a recommendation to the court that Arthur should have contact with his mum, should have contact by telephone remotely to start with, and almost sort of reinstigating what had been happening with the maternal grandparents, but as a step towards seeing his mum, because she felt that was in his best interest emotionally and mentally, in the way that Sarah was describing earlier. So that is a very important piece of learning for Cafcass. I found that we didn't have a policy or a guidance on applications from parents in prison. We didn't have anything distinct. There was elements of it in other bits of policy and guidance, but not specifically. And so one of the pieces of learning is that we've put in place a policy and guidance to support family court advisors in making those really tricky judgment calls when it comes to having a parent in prison, but not losing sight of the impact that it can have. Unfortunately, as most of you will know, Arthur was murdered before the family court managed to make that decision. Yep, that's all I want to say. That you know, through being a practitioner, through being a manager, and through listening to children, listening to parents of children, that's where our biggest evidence base comes from. Obviously, we all read a lot of evidence and research, but that's what happens. And it had such an impact on me when I was first a probation officer. The impact for families, the impact particularly for children in my case, the damage that could cause, and all the things that we know that we've just heard about. Howard League for Penal Reform has written about endlessly about the long-term effects of having a parent who's in prison, the impact on the child's self-identity, their sense of self and their futures. And for me, since starting and certainly now working in Cafcass, that's absolutely paramount in my mind. And I know it is for everybody that works in Cafcass too. So that's me. I'm going to hand back to you, Nicola.
Thank you very much, Jack. And next we hear from Lord Fred. Thank you.
Thank you. So I hadn't prepared anything for talking now, and I just wanted to do some reflections on what I've just heard. And interestingly, from Sarah Burrows' talk, it made me reflect on the very first time I took an interest in the criminal justice system, which was about 20 years ago, probably more than 20 years ago, when I became a trustee of a prison visitor centre, Wandsworth Prison. And it was a new thing for me. I didn't know anything about criminal justice at that time. But it was interesting because when I was a trustee, what we were interested in is fundraising to help the families who were visiting prisoners in Wandsworth. And I've just written a little list here about the help which worked and the help which didn't work. So the things which really helped was talking to the families, because they had similar issues of how they were going to manage the situation when the father came out of prison and went back home. So the transition to release was a very good series of courses which the mums and their children were very interested in attending, of how they were going to manage the transition for when the dads came out of prison. The other thing which was very important to talk about, and they got a lot of take up on, was managing how the children and mothers should present what's happened to the schools. And I don't think there was a single answer to that problem, but it was something they collectively talked about a lot, about how that process should be managed, and being very aware of the vulnerability of the children whose fathers were in school. Other very practical things were useful, like talking about housing and whether there were going to be housing issues when the dad came out, whether there was a new partner on the scene, all those sorts of things there was a big take up on, and they were very successful things that visitor centre did. Interestingly, the things that were not successful was when we spent a lot of money on buying computers to try and improve the reading and writing of the families, because as we all know, a lot of those families have poor reading and writing ability. We got virtually no take up of that. They really weren't that interested, but they were interested in the other courses which I've just talked about. So anyway, that was my reflection on some of the things that Sarah was saying when she made her introduction. And in fact, it was that experience that prompted me to apply to be a magistrate. And I now sit as a magistrate in both adult, youth and family courts. So I see different aspects of these problems from the different courts I sit in. I have to say, I think I can literally say I have never sent anyone to prison who I didn't know whether they had children or not. It's very, very unusual for magistrates to send somebody to prison without a probation report. And I would expect to see in that probation report whether there are dependent children. And on the basis of that, that would certainly be a factor whether one goes ahead and sends somebody to jail. It's very, very unusual to send somebody to jail without a report. I think the stat which Sarah gave, that there's 65% of children who go to prison, children whose parents are in prison, then go on to be sent to prison themselves. I think that's a stat I picked up. Very, very conscious of that. In youth court, as I'm sure, is yacht covered by Napo as well? Yacht. Yes, okay. So yacht, they tend to write much more lengthy reports on the youths, and a very, very high proportion of the children we send to custody there are in some form of care. Very, very high proportion are in gang-related crime, and a very high proportion are moving between houses to try and extricate themselves from the gang-related crime. So I do my youth work at Highbury Magistrates Courts, which I think is one of the largest youth courts in the country. We have 7 yachts that report there. And we're very, very conscious that this is a last resort. It's really not something we want to do. But sometimes we are forced to do it because of the violent nature of the offences. The other point I wanted to make on what Sarah said was another hat I wear is that I'm a trustee of an alternative school arrangement. It's a number of schools actually in London and just outside London. So as you all know, alternative education is for children who've been excluded from mainstream education. And one of the things I found most shocking about being part of those groups of schools, they're great schools, I think they do a fantastic job, but one of the most shocking things I've found is the number of children who they really don't know where they are at any time. They've dropped out of the alternative school provision. They're supposed to have home tutoring, that never happens. And there's a sort of grey area, really quite a lot of children where there is no institutional arrangements for those children at all. And it's an issue. I know that the school itself understands this very well. There are limits to what you can do to actually try and track down these children and identify them. And of course, they've already, a lot of them, been in trouble with criminal justice, but it's very likely they'll get further into trouble with the criminal justice system. So that's another reflection on what Sarah was saying. Just moving on to what Jack was saying about Cafcass. Obviously, I agree about the trauma and stigma of putting put on children through their parents being in prison. I thought I'd just mention Lord Farmer's report. Michael Farmer, he's a Tory peer, and he won't mind me saying this because he said it in public a few times. When he was a child, his family was an abusive family, a violent family, which had a big impact on him. And he's made a lot of money. And basically, he's spending quite a lot of that money in writing reports and financing them for the government on ways of and the importance of family for serving prisoners, and how to try to maintain those relationships, and how important it is to maintain those relationships to try and stop the intergenerational problems which we've all been talking about. I think he's been quite influential actually on Conservative and government policy. And although there are aspects of what he said which I wouldn't agree with and the Labour Party wouldn't agree with, nevertheless, he has done a lot of work on this, particularly on family hubs, which some of you will know that expression. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the way children are treated in family courts. It's quite unusual, but it does happen, and I've had it done a few times myself, where you're dealing with a family situation and the local authorities involved, and there are various alternative carers because the parents, for whatever reason, are not able to offer a sufficient level of care for the child. But it is something which we do every now and again, where the child comes to court, and the child will explain to us what they would like to happen, what they think of the situation. And I have to say, it's one of the most moving bits of process that I've ever done. And I'll just tell this one anecdote of a mother. She was a mother who was neglectful of her children. The children were effectively parenting the mother, been going on for years, and finally the local authority bit the bullets and applied to take the children into care. And what was very, very moving is that the 12-year-old girl, who was likely the mother of the family, asked to see me in private, which I did it with the other magistrates and a lawyer. It wasn't very private, there were about 5 of us in the room actually. But the point I want to make is that girl, she looked at me and her eyes filled up with tears. And she said something different to me in private to what she had been saying in court in front of her mother. Basically, she said she understood that her mother couldn't cope and that things needed to change. She didn't want to say that in the courtroom because she didn't want to be disloyal to her mother. So, to be honest, my eyes filled with tears as well when she said that to me, and we, proceeded along the lines which she suggested. And we took the responsibility for doing that as the bad guys in the court. So the mother, so the child didn't have that sort of responsibility put on them like that. So, and I know in addition to that, Cafcass arranges a group of young people who've been through the care system. They've got a special. What?
Justice Young People's Board.
So Family Justice Young People's Board, I've been to a couple of presentations by them, and they quite often they're a bit older, they're late teens, if not 20, but they've been through the process. And they invariably say the same thing, which is we want to be involved. Firstly, we want to be involved. And secondly, we understand we're children, and we understand that the court may have to do things different to what we want to happen. Right. And I thought that was something which we need to be a bit bolder on. So yes, listen to what the children want to say, but also make it very clear that we as magistrates or judges or whoever are making a legal decision, and it may be different to what they want to hear. So if you set the ground clearly, I think it's fair enough to listen to them in that context, and they understand that in my experience. So the whole theme here is about hidden sentences for children whose parents are in prison, and I think the theme I draw from that, from what we've heard and also my own experiences, is we shouldn't be too timid about asking children themselves. We should make it very clear that we're the ones making the decisions in terms of court or social workers or whoever. But children are very, very realistic, in my experience, on understanding what's the best position for their family. That's what I want to say.
Many thanks, Fred.
Yeah.
We will now take questions. Thank you. Just for information as well, Sarah's kindly allowed us to, the slides from her presentation will be uploaded to the Napo website, so look out for those. Thank you. Yes, please. Thank you.
This is built for tall people. Anne King, Western Branch. I worked for a long time in a women's prison, and while I was there, the Corson report was written. What's happened to the Corson report? What's happened to all that evidence that showed that the estate for women doesn't meet the needs of either the women themselves or their children?
Thank you. Could we have Jack and Sarah back on the screen, please? There we are. Everyone's back together. Thank you. Does anyone want to take that question at all?
So I know Jean Corston a bit, not that well, I have to say, and it is absolutely a seminal report, and it's referred to very, very often. I think one of the principal recommendations was to try and drastically reduce short prison sentences for women. That is a campaign which is ongoing. It's a point which I make. Personally, I'm not in favour of banning them completely, which some of the pressure groups want, but I do think there is a strong argument for reducing them very, very significantly. I mean, as everyone here will know, for youths, there's a minimum sentence of 4 months. So that's serve 2 months and then 2 months out of the community. I mean, maybe it should be a similar minimum sentence for women. I have to say my own experience though for women is that I think I can literally say I've never sent a woman to prison who hasn't been on multiple community-based sentences where things have gone wrong. And you simply run out of options after a while. And sometimes, it sounds a bit cruel to say it, but sometimes the perspective of a sentencer, when you've got so many, it's not unusual to have, a couple of community sentences running in parallel, a huge amount of requirements made, and they're just not working. Sometimes the perspective is, if we just get a short sentence, it'll clear the decks, and then when she comes out, she can start without all these constraints on her. It's not a very comfortable decision to make, but I have been in a position where we thought that's the best thing to do.
Thank you. Jack and Sarah, did you want to come in at all on that question?
As I just wanted to say from a child's perspective more, because that really is our focus, and often, obviously, there's a lot of talk around mothers in prison, but there seems to be very little about children who have a mother in prison, and specifically the focus. So that all the research and data is quite out of date in terms of what is cited. We're really interested in, at the moment, we have a worker specifically looking at children whose mothers are in prison. The children that we support whose mothers are in prison, a custodial sentence would be the only option. And then looking in terms of children's identity and feelings and how they are when their mothers have done such serious crimes, and how they then feel. So there seems to be very, very little out there from the child's perspective always. There seems to be much more around the parent's perspective, but our focus has to be on what is in the best interest of the child, how does the child feel, and in terms of their identity going forward and who they are, and listening to them, whether they want a relationship, whether they don't want a relationship, how they want the relationship to look, and actually trying to do it from the child's perspective. And our experiences have been that the children are often overlooked, really.
Thank you, Sarah. Did you want to come in, Jack, on that?
I'm familiar with the Corston report, Baroness Corston's report, but the point that I was wanting to make was similar to what Fred was saying earlier, about what is the impact of whatever sentence is being given on the child. I mean, that we are in the luxurious position in Cafcass of putting the welfare of the child absolutely centre and paramount. And I think it's just really important for the court, and certainly as a probation officer, going back to the 80s, I don't think we were clear enough then about the impact of sentences of certainly the child's primary carer, whatever gender, on the child. And I just think it's really important for probation service when undertaking reports, not to overly influence the sentence, but for everyone to be really clear about what that impact could be and what needs to happen to be able to mitigate the impact of that on the child. Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Jack.
I have a question, and maybe Sarah, it's for you. So as we know, it can take up to 2 years for a case to actually get into court. But just hearing that first really, really powerful clip when the house received the knock, who is there or what support is there for those families following that life-changing event prior to prosecution and sentencing?
Sadly, very little. There's very little. We are the only charity that specifically supports children with a parent in prison in their community. If they're not going to the court, if they're not going to the prisons, they're not being picked up by family services. As I said last week when we were looking at it, only a third of the children we support. We have numerous referrals, particularly around people that have had the knock around sex offences and their father being arrested. And we can't, you know, we are tiny and we aren't eligible for any statutory funding. It is all grants and trusts and fundraising. That's all we do to manage it. And we look and we cannot find support. We cannot find support in other areas of the country, hence why we're providing virtual support. Virtual support isn't good enough in terms of what we're doing. I don't believe it helps, it supports, it makes children feel less isolated, it gives them space to talk about it. It isn't the same as the face-to-face support. And yet we cannot find really good community supporting children with a parent in prison in custody, let alone the ones on community orders or waiting sentencing.
Thank you, Sarah. I need to take some questions from the hall now. So the speaker here on my left.
Thank you. My name's Jill Narron. I'm from South-Western branch. I'm really interested in the speeches because I'm a probation officer seconded to the youth justice team, as we're called in Plymouth. So it's been really interesting to hear what you've had to say, and I'm particularly interested in Sarah's organisation, and I hope that we would see something like that in the Southwest. The other thing I was going to say about parents in prison, the problem that we've got is obviously, as we know, the Tories want to build these big mega prisons, and that's going to mean a greater distance for for the youngsters to go to. We've also in the Southwest lost our YOI, and there could be younger parents there as well. So that makes it incredibly difficult. How would you suggest we can ameliorate all of this with the distance of prisons at the moment from where their bases are, the home countries are, hometowns are? That's it.
Thank you. So would you like to come back on that at all?
I really wouldn't be able to answer it. One of the reasons I'm not here today was the cost of the train fare to come to Eastbourne. We're a small charity. The funding bit is an issue, and you talk. The person who just asked the question was saying about in their area. When I set up Children Heard and Seen, I was the Youth Offending Service Manager. I was concerned about the number of children entering the criminal justice system, had a parent in prison. I set it up alongside my day job. And that's, you know, in terms of having to develop and doing it, I do see it as a problem of how do you get community support for children impacted by parental imprisonment when there is lack of funding, and it is literally grants, trusts, fundraising all the time, every day, trying to do, you know, I don't know going forward how. We have really tried in terms of with the MOJ, we've tried with the Department of Education. These children are slipping through the net. You know, I'd like to see it in terms of universal services picking it up, maybe through pupil premium, you know, identified through school and being supported. But children aren't supported. You know, there is sort of hidden sentence training and training about how schools maybe could work better with children. But where is the support for children with a parent in prison? It's you know, we are a small charity. That it's, you know, the amount of referrals we have daily is enormous. We cannot cope with capacity. We only take self-referrals from family members because we cannot manage it. I don't know. So I'm really sorry that I'm not that helpful, but yeah.
Thank you. You've been extremely helpful today, Sarah, actually. So thank you. And I'll come to you, Jack. Thanks.
I think it's a massive issue. Again, I will just give examples from my own experience that not only the cost of travel is absolutely prohibitive to people. And there was a time where you could get support for the cost of travel. And if the benefits agency, as was then, wasn't providing the money, the probation service had a fund, and there were charitable funds to enable families to visit. However, the cost of travel isn't the only issue. For older children that have friendship groups and weekend activities, and you're playing football or netball or whatever, it's very, very disruptive. The length of travel, the time it takes is so disruptive to the child's patterns, their friendships, in the way that Sarah was describing. So the idea of mega prisons, you know, further afield is, I think, potentially very damaging to families and to the experience of children in being able to maintain those really important relationships with the people they have a bond with. Thank you, Nicola.
I can see we've got two more, I think, is it three? Three more people wishing to ask questions in the hall. So thank you, take it away.
I'm Catherine Oakley from the Napo Cymru branch. We've had obviously history in Wales of obviously parental imprisonment support services through, there was an initiative through Invisible Walls Wales, which was sort of run by Bernardo's, and I think that is still working in Park Prison, which is a private prison. I recently went on a visit to see sort of what sort of services they offer, which is, you know, they try and do what they can, is outstanding. And obviously there was another officer there from another prison in Berwyn Prison in North Wales saying they're trying to set up things, and like, you know, you're nowhere near of what they're offering in a private prison. Look, you know, and back in 2014-15, when I started the service from coming over from a social work sector, we had staff who were seconded, probation staff who were seconded within Wales in certain areas where families that are affected by parental imprisonment were we had support from probation staff who were trained. And obviously, as it goes in probation, obviously funding only lasts for so long with these charity sectors, they get pulled. And obviously that service ended. And in terms of obviously, particularly with child contact applications, obviously I don't know whether legality has changed now in terms of Section 7 applications, private law applications for contact. It can also almost become sort of the legal aid budget has got cut, and look, you know, for that person in prison to sort of have the appropriate legal support as well. I think it all boils down to sort of funding, and obviously I know things have evolved in Wales and we do have a family significant other strategy, but in terms of obviously actual action on the ground, I think we see all these strategies and policies, but no action in terms of behind the funding and actually resourcing these things. And I think, what is it going to take to, like, you know, fund these good initiatives? Like, you know, there are stuff going on in parts of the country, but like, you know, I think these children are suffering, and like, you know, and not given the right support. So what's it going to take in terms of, like, you know, providing the right funding and support?
Anyone want to make any comments about that contribution at all? Jack, thank you.
I think you're absolutely right. There's definitely a funding issue there. But one of the things that there used to be, and I don't know because I'm not so familiar with the work of the probation service now, or of Napo, as I once was when I was a member and a branch secretary. But there was a very strong campaign element to influence the prisons inspectorate, HMIP, to have a higher focus on certainly the facilities for children and families visiting. I've got no idea whether the Inspectorate of Prisons has that focus now, but it's nothing like having the Inspectorate breathing down your neck to think about how, as a prison governor and a board, that we think about how we're going to spend our money. So I think there is an argument for really encouraging the Inspectorate of Prisons to have that higher focus. I know there's some focus, but to have a higher focus on that, because that would concentrate the minds of the people that have the responsibility for the prison budget. Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you, Jack. George, Fred.
So I agree with what Catherine said about strategy and policies, but no action. I'm just reflecting that since we're moving to these larger prisons and more, at the same time, more specialist prisons, there are many common problems with that strategy. And we talk about it in the context of women's prisons. There's actually another context in that I went to a sex offenders prison just outside Cambridgeshire about 5 years ago now. And in fact, I was a lay inspector. So I turned up with the official inspectors unannounced to inspect this, I think it's called Littlehaven, the prison just outside Cambridge. And one of the things the inspectorate were very interested in were facilities for families to visit the men before they were released. I mean, since they were sex offenders, some of them didn't have any ongoing family relationships, but others did. And if they did, they wanted them to be able to maintain them. And it was the same problems. It was long distances to travel. It was what happens if they've got to stay overnight, who's going to pay for it? And so while they actually have some very good facilities for receiving families, one of the criticisms which was made, I think, in the report is there wasn't enough to actually make it happen because they just weren't turning up. So, you know, it's a problem, and it in a sense, it goes to the point which Jack said, is that, you know, the underlying problem is having these mega prisons which are dispersed in various bits of the country, and some people have to travel an awfully long way. I went to another prison, a secure children's home in Sheffield. So this is the most secure, most expensive way of keeping a young person. There's one youth there who was from Plymouth, and he was there in Sheffield, you know, and his parents just didn't ever visit him. So there you go. That's what that's one aspect of the problem.
Thank you very much. We are running short of time, so I'm going to just ask the last two questions together, and then I'll ask for some responses. Thank you.
Keith Sorko, staff of West Mids. I have the greatest respect for the bench, but as a court report writer, and the last time we were here, I was putting a case for a woman who had been recidively going through sentencings on a regular basis. And one of the reasons she was having this is because she couldn't escape an abusive relationship where there was no accommodation. And I had a lot of research to do to get that sorted out. We don't have the time. As a court officer, I have 2.5 hours to write a report. What is your point of being able to improve our practice if we need to do the research to find out what the children are about? In yours, there was a combination of social services, the police, education, all in one place. I have to work hard to get that information, and not every agency comes up with the goods. So getting the child view is hard. I just want to know what the panel's got to say. Thank you.
My name is Tunjai from London branch. That's a question to Jack. Do you think the cooperation between probation and Cafcass is sufficiently strong? I mean, you know, we don't see the Cafcass officers in MAPA meetings, you know, hardly in professionals meetings, and, you know, it's a bit of indirect relationship. I say that because, you know, we assess risk to children in domestic violence context, and I can endlessly, you know, elaborate to the impact of domestic violence on children. But at the same time, if I go to the other side of the equation, I can also endlessly elaborate how it can contribute to this relationship between, you know, male perpetrator and the child, to rehabilitation and treatment, and, you know, gaining goals, and, you know, and I think on the victim side and on the perpetrator side. So that's a delicate thing, and we look to Cafcass for judgment. Is it sufficiently cooperative? That's the case.
Thank you very much.
Great question.
What I'm going to do is just come to final reflections from each member of the panel. If they want to pick up some of those points, that would be interesting. So maybe, Fred, shall I come to you first?
The second last questioner, that gentleman there, he was talking about the time it takes to get the information together to write a decent report. Interestingly, in Westminster and Westminster Magistrates Courts, we've got a specialist domestic abuse court. And what that means in practice is that we get extra funding from the local authorities, which are Hammersmith and Fulham, Kensington, Chelsea and Westminster, so fairly wealthy local authorities. And at the back of the court sit a couple of officers who are funded, and they get the information, they get a rounded view. I'm talking about criminal court here. They get a rounded view of the family background of the person we've got in the dock. So basically it's social work intervention, call outs, all these sorts of things you would normally see in a family court, but you wouldn't normally see in a bail hearing in a criminal court, okay? But the key is the extra funding. That's one key. And the other key is having a dedicated group of the two people who sit there, and they have that information. So when we're making bail decisions, we have a much more rounded picture about whether it's appropriate for that defendant to get bail. So I just use that as an example of you need to put additional resource in to get a rounded picture of the situation you're dealing with. That's one example where in Westminster Magistrates we do it, but it's because the funding is available. That's not
Thank you, Lord Fred.
Yeah.
I'll next come to Jack. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. I think I need to clarify the point that although I was once a probation officer, I'm not pretending for 1 minute that I know what it's like to be a probation officer now. And the time that you have to do a report, I'm not sure if I'd have made a very good probation officer, because I used to spend a lot of time with people and with other people as well. I had none of those time constraints that you have now. I was supposed to do X number of reports in a year and in a quarter, and my senior probation officer was very, very tight on that. But the idea of being able to do it in that time scale and do some of the things which I've suggested about trying to understand the impact of a sentence on a child, I'm not envying you the job, but Nicola knows that I can be very demanding of family court advisors and children's guardians as well. So I'm not distancing myself from unrealistic expectations on occasions as well, Nicola. Just so you know that I'm aware as much as I can be of that. I think the point about the liaison between a family court advisor or a child's guardian, the probation service, is a really important one. We have very good checks in Cafcass, checks with local authorities, checks with police. I'm not sure if we are as consistent as we should be in terms of liaising with the probation service. We've rewritten our policy on seeking the perspectives and the views of other professionals who are involved with the individual who's making the application or with the wider family. And I'm not sure, I ought to be, obviously, so I don't want to be quoted, and I know this isn't going out to too many people. That's a joke, by the way. But I think I need to check that policy to see whether probation is specifically mentioned in there. Because when we're assessing the likelihood of harm and the severity of harm for a child, why on earth wouldn't we consult with the probation service? So I'm going to go away and I'm going to check that, and I'm going to feed back to Nicola what I've found and any adjustments that we need to make. So thank you so much for raising that. And thank you, Nicola, for inviting me today. It's been an absolute privilege. And as I said at the beginning, it's taken me back in a really good way. So thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm going to give the final word to Sarah, so thank you.
I'm not equipped to answer the last two questions. We are a community resource, but what I just want to say is that with support, children really do flourish. We've supported over 700 children. Only 3 have gone on to offend. And I see absolute genuine change. It's small amounts of funding create differences for children and they currently are very, very invisible. And anything that can happen to change that would just be amazing.